But Casey, thank you for that introduction. Thank you also, Karen and Sabine, for your help in getting this off the ground. And thank you to CSU for having me back again. This is the second time I've presented for CSU, and I'm happy to do so. Thank all of you for being here live, if you're here live. And if you're watching a recording of this, thank you for being here as well. All of you, whether you are live or recorded, or watching the recording rather, will have my email at the end of this presentation. And I encourage you to please reach out if you have any questions or just want to talk about these concepts and related ideas, because I'm happy to do so. My name is Patrick, as Casey said. I am a social worker. I worked in libraries for about 6 years. Now I teach at the University of Texas at Austin here in the States, but I'll tell you a little bit more about myself here in just a second. So today we're going to be talking about some difficult stuff. I encourage everybody to take good care of themselves as we move through this. Specifically, we'll be talking a little bit about hate speech. In this case, it was directed towards Asian Americans and people specifically of Chinese descent. I encourage you to do what you need to do to take good care of you as we move through this presentation, please. So goals for this morning, for those of you in Australia, this evening, for those of you who may be in the States, is, well, first I'm going to tell you an unfortunate story from my time as a library social worker. We'll consider that story, and we'll also think about what it says about how libraries take care of vulnerable folks, and really the responsibility that I think public institutions, particularly libraries, of course, have in taking good care of vulnerable populations. Also talk about what that means, vulnerable. And then finally, we'll discuss courage. And that may seem an odd topic for a presentation on libraries, but I think that when we're talking about social work, librarianship, and becoming an interdisciplinary institution in our libraries, I think that that really takes courage. And courage for me goes hand in hand with vulnerability as well. And so we'll talk about that and why I think that courage and vulnerability are really necessary in order to challenge the status quo and kind of push back on the way we've always done it. And we should have plenty of time for the folks who are here live to ask a few questions if you like. So about me, I've been a social worker since 2012. However, I've been doing social service and nonprofit work since 2005. After graduating with my master's in social work, I worked in schools for a few years, and I worked in child welfare for a few years. And then in 2016, I really fell into library social work by almost sheer coincidence. I was the first library social worker in the state of Texas, and I was one of the first in the United States. When I began this work, I think there were probably 10 to 20 systems in the United States with helping professionals like me on staff. Today, I think that number is probably closer to 50. And of course, it is spreading not only in the United States, but also to Australia, obviously. And I believe we've got a few people in Canada now as well. In 2018, I was lucky to be part of the first cohort of members of the United States Public Library Association Social Worker Task Force. Unfortunately, that group is now defunct. That's a long story that I don't have time to get into at the moment, but again, email me if you're curious about that. A few years after that, I moved on from the Georgetown Public Library and to the state library, this Texas State Library. At that time, I also started teaching and was able to slide after a year right over into a full-time teaching position at the University of Texas, which I'm super pleased about. And I suspect the Texas State Library was also pleased about for reasons that may become apparent throughout this presentation. And there's my friend Coach, as you can see, looking grumpy as usual. So I want to start with a story. Many of us in our libraries have story time regularly, and we're going to start there today. Unfortunately, as I've already mentioned, this story is not a happy one. So please bear with me as I share this. So I want to take us back in time a little bit to October of 2020. Obviously, all of us were in the midst of the pandemic at this point, really at its height still. I think many of us may have been cooped up in our houses and not seeing our friends and working from home and that sort of thing. Additionally, here in the United States, we were in the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement. It was the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd. We were in the midst also of a contentious and sometimes absurd presidential election. It was a very stressful time. And to add to that, we were also seeing, both in the United States and around the world, racist violence against people of Asian descent. To be clear, these things are still happening. Unfortunately, they are not in the news like they were, however, at the time. These things were heavily reported in the States, at least in 2020. So keep in mind the context as we move through these emails that I'm about to show you. So when in Texas, we went back to work in person in libraries on May 1st, 2020. Still very much at the height of the pandemic, and we could talk about that for a long time, but we were back in person in May of 2020. And in the fall, we started allowing volunteers actually to come back into the building as well. That was not my choice, perhaps goes without saying, but volunteers were in the building. And I heard from my desk a volunteer say loudly enough for me to hear him very clearly from about 25 feet away, "That's another reason I hate the Chinese." He did not say, "I hate China." He did not say, "I hate the Chinese government." He said, "I hate the Chinese, which are a people." And so I considered this racist hate speech, and I still do. And as you can see here, I documented that via email, and that was a purposeful decision because it is publicly available information here in the US, and which is why I don't feel any guilt about sharing these emails with you right now. And I put it in writing, and I asked to be notified of the follow-up on this situation. Shortly thereafter, that same day, a coworker of mine, our volunteer coordinator, who is a fantastic person, took the bull by the horns and spoke to this volunteer within 2 hours. I heard her do it. I appreciate her very much, but unfortunately, she was not empowered by library administration at that time to make decisions to remove volunteers from their positions. And so, although she did speak to this volunteer, as you can see here, he was not removed from the library at this point. And I had, and frankly still have, a problem with this, as you can tell. So the following day, having heard nothing from my library director, who is also my direct supervisor, I emailed that person specifically. And as you can see here, I recommended my professional recommendation as a justice-driven social worker was to remove this person as a volunteer. He was violating the city's, of course, I'm working for a city government, and he was violating the city's policy on prohibited conduct, as you can see here. Now, this policy does not apply to volunteers. In fact, we did not have any policies regarding the behavior of volunteers. And so, as you can see at the bottom of this slide, that I want to be a part of this policy development. I want to know what policies we have. And it also recalled for me an instance, or unfortunately, instances of sexual harassment committed by another older male volunteer against one of our female staff that went on for far too long before that person was removed. And so I asked that we develop policies if they don't exist, and that I would like to be a part of that. The kicker here is that this library at the time was also promoting How to Be an Anti-Racist, which is a book by Ibram X. Kendi. And in that book, Kendi essentially says, racist and anti-racist is binary. You are one or the other. There is no in between. If you claim to be non-racist, and meaning that you are not racist, but you also don't challenge racism, that basically puts you in the camp of the racists because you're allowing it to happen. And so I told my director that if we believe in what this book is promoting and what we are promoting, then we are on the wrong side of that binary and are a racist institution. We were in the midst of a campaign called All Are Welcome here. And as you can see here, I said that if we say all are welcome, then we also need to say that hate has no place here. And unfortunately, this argument was unsuccessful. And the director at that time said that he's not ready to remove, Colin was the name of this volunteer at this time. And he also said that we should have some clear policies about dealing with volunteers that have some sort of issue like this. However, it's important to note here that this person had been director of the library for over 20 years and had had ample opportunity to institute policies around equity, inclusion, behaviors from volunteers, and none of that had happened. So again, at this point, I was still angry and upset that we weren't doing anything to protect our Asian American patrons and staff. And so at this point, I actually reported all of this to Human Resources. They never did anything to my knowledge, did not take action. Subsequent to this, the library director who wrote this email retired in January of 2021. I think in part because staff members, including myself, really holding this director's feet to the fire in regards to staff safety regarding COVID. Again, keep in mind, we're back in person in May of 2020. The volunteers are back in the building. Staff are on edge. I know of 2 panic attacks that happened during this period of time among staff, and that's just what I know of. And of course, I'm also pestering this director regarding hate speech in the workplace. And so this person retired. The assistant director was then promoted to director, and I went to that person and I forwarded all the emails that you just saw, and I said, I don't know if you know about this, but this happened, and I still recommend strongly that we remove this volunteer. And again, this new director said that it was appropriate to give Colin, the racist volunteer, a second chance. And then at the bottom, you can see that another staff member has also been wanting to work on policies regarding volunteer expectations and behavior. And now that we have volunteers coming back in, it will be a priority. So last time I checked with my friends and former coworkers at this library, it had been well over 18 months since this email was written, and there were no policies that had been developed regarding volunteer behavior. So again, I would challenge the use of the word priority here. So as Marvin Gaye said, what's going on with all of this? So for me, and that's Dolly Parton, if you don't know, I'm a big Dolly fan. These decisions were political, first and foremost, or these lack of decisions, really. Here in the community that I live in, and at the time served at that public library, many of the folks who volunteered for the library are older white adults. Many are retired. The city in which this library sits has a median age of about 44. We are just north of Austin, Texas, at the tippy top of the Austin metro area, if you're familiar with Texas at all. And however, this city of Austin has a median age of 30. So we are significantly older. Older adults in this community carry a lot of political power because they make up a large percentage of the population, and they vote. And so upsetting this older white racist volunteer could potentially cause a snowball of more upset older, presumably white volunteers who don't think that saying that you hate the Chinese is an offensive, problematic statement. So I think that these two library directors were thinking of the political implications by not taking any action towards this volunteer. This is also a money-driven decision. As you can maybe already guess, A large number of the donors to this library were also older white folks, much like the person who had said that they hate the Chinese. And I think that, again, throwing this person out of his volunteer gig would have potentially upset some of our donors. And so this was a money-driven decision. Perhaps it goes without saying this was a decision driven also by white supremacy. I know Beth Waller has a talk as a part of this series, and in it, I expect that she talks a little bit about felt safety. If you've watched that presentation, then you already know that felt safety is a little bit different from literal safety, right? We always want to be literally safe, and most of the time our libraries are literally safe, but they don't always feel safe. And what has happened with this decision is that the library administrators have sacrificed the felt safety and perhaps even the real literal safety of people of color, especially Asian Americans, at the feet of older white men. We are purposefully choosing to prioritize the entitlement of older white racist men rather than prioritize the real and felt safety of people of color in the library. This is keeping with the status quo. Obviously, we're thinking more about politics, about money, rather than shaking things up and trying to rethink the way that the library served the community. And then finally, to be completely frank, I think that this was a cowardly decision. For me, removal of hateful people from volunteering at a public library is an easy decision. If you are someone who is volunteering in a public space, you cannot use hate speech, period. And if you do, you got to go. I don't understand how this is a difficult decision for not one, but two library directors. It is an easy decision. And the fact that they could not stand up to this volunteer and his cohort of older folks, to me, is just disappointing and unfortunate. Because as far as I'm concerned, the job of public institutions and really of government as a whole is to keep its residents and its citizens safe and informed, especially vulnerable people like people of color, like Asian Americans. And again, this lack of action, this lack of removal of hate speech and the person saying it sacrifices the safety of Asian American patrons and staff at the feet of older white men. And so I've been throwing this word vulnerable around a few times. And if we were in the same room together right now, I would ask you to literally tell me the answer to this question. But consider for a moment, who comes to mind when you hear the phrase vulnerable patron? And so these are a few of the populations that you may be thinking of right now. Folks with low incomes, older adults who lack friendship or familial support, folks with physical and ongoing mental health challenges, people experiencing homelessness, children, members of oppressed and marginalized populations like the queer community, people of color, indigenous folks, folks who have been victims of domestic violence or sexual assault, who comprise, sadly, a huge percentage of the folks that we serve. Just anecdotally, I can tell you that when I was working in the library, I tracked this information, and about 1 in 6 of the people that I worked with in the public library volunteered histories that involved being victims of domestic violence. I was not asking them outright. I was not saying, have you ever been a victim of domestic violence? They were just telling me their story, and it came out. So I consider 1 in 6 to really be the floor. I assume that more than 1 in 6 of our library patrons have experienced domestic violence in their past, unfortunately. Also, people with significant trauma histories could be considered a vulnerable population as well. This is, as you can tell, not an exhaustive list, but these are the folks who come to mind for me. When I think about defining a vulnerable patron or just vulnerable person, I think that of folks whose basic needs are just not being met by the existing resources in our community. which is where we come in as public libraries. I talk a lot about protective factors and the way in which I see public libraries as protective in the lives of all of our patrons, but particularly folks who are having a hard time. This definition comes to us from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration here in the US, also known as SAMHSA. And as you can see here, they talk about protective factors as being characteristics associated with a lower likelihood of negative outcomes or that reduce a risk factor's impact. You might think of growing up in a two-parent household as a protective factor, having healthy food on the table, having educational and professional opportunities, having consistent access to transportation. All of those are protective factors. The theater class that you were in high school that kept you from smoking too much pot and getting into trouble was protective for you. The friend who comes over to your house with pizza and wine or ice cream or whatever it is that you like after you've lost a loved one, that your friend is a protective factor in your lives. And I think that the public library is a protective factor in the lives of all of our patrons, but most importantly, in the lives of those vulnerable populations that we were just talking about. If you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is this pyramid over here on the right of your screen, you may recognize this if you've taken Psychology 101, whether in high school or university. This probably looks very familiar. And Abraham Maslow said, in order for us to really reach our full potential, or to what he called self-actualize, we had to climb this pyramid starting at the bottom. And I think that it's really powerful to think about how much of these things our libraries provide, right? Most of our libraries have water and heat in the winter and air conditioning in the summer. And we may even provide snacks and food, or maybe we have a food pantry come visit periodically. I'm happy to talk to you about that. If anybody's curious, I can tell you more. Please email me. Most of our libraries are safe most of the time. Many times we've seen our patrons establish friendships. Sometimes we may even become, perhaps not friends, but friendly with our patrons. Relationships, friendships, intimacy are all cultivated, often organically, which is so beautiful in our public libraries. Perhaps less common, but I think we can also help folks come to feelings of prestige or accomplishment. I think of a library I used to work at, and we would have art showings there was always art on the wall. And oftentimes the art on the wall was created by community members, older adults, people with developmental disabilities, just artists in general. And we would put their art on the wall and we would sell it, or they would sell it, right? We weren't taking the money. They could sell their art on the wall. And when I think about folks for whom art has been kind of a solitary activity, and moving from that into a place where they get to publicly display their art and maybe even sell it to people who are excited to buy it, I think about how powerful that might be for some folks in establishing some feelings of like, wow, I really did that. And people appreciated it. And the library played a part in that. Self-actualization, I don't know if we can necessarily get people over that hump. I don't know if I'm over that hump myself. But certainly libraries help people move in that direction. And so one thing that was really confusing, I think, for the library staff and the librarians who did typical library work was that sometimes they would come to me and say, hey, there's a person on the floor who seems to be having a really hard time, and I think you should talk to them. And sometimes I would kind of walk by the patron and I would see them using a computer or talking to a friend or reading the paper. And then I would return to the staff person and say, well, did you tell this person that I'm available? And they would say, yes. And I would say, did they ask to speak to me? And the staff person would say, no. And I would not approach that person, because the first question that I was always asking myself as a library social worker about to engage a patron or not was, is what I'm about to do going to increase or decrease the likelihood that this person comes back tomorrow? Because in my community, which has only one public library, no shelters of any kind, very few air-conditioned places, If I'm in somebody's face and they don't want me there, if I'm being nosy or asking questions that they don't want to answer, maybe they've had negative experiences with social workers and other helping professionals in the past, and I'm upsetting them, and they decide they're not coming back to the library tomorrow, and it's 107 degrees Fahrenheit outside, that puts them in real, literal danger. And so I was always trying to think, first and foremost, how can I keep people coming back to the library? And this is one thing that I think a lot of library administrators who are bringing in helping professionals either on staff or by contract, I think they misunderstand. I think oftentimes library administrators think that social workers or helping professionals in libraries are going to find apartments for people experiencing homelessness, and that those people will then stop coming to the library. That is not true. If somebody does get housed, they're probably going to keep coming back to the library. And in fact, I'm going to encourage them to do so for all of the reasons that we've already talked about, all of those big, important protective factors and resources that we provide. Also, sometimes I think that library administrators think that we are somehow going to run interference between patrons with high needs, whether that be addiction or mental health or grief or whatever it may be. We're going to somehow come in between those folks and the service desk and kind of keep them away from the service desk. Also not true, because those populations of folks have every right to use the service desk just like any other patron. My goal is to keep folks coming back, especially vulnerable folks. So if you or an administrator at your library are considering bringing someone like me to your library, bear in mind that we are not going to try to nudge vulnerable people out of the library. We are not going to try and keep them away from service desks. We are going to invite them to come in more and more, to become more and more a part of the community that we are trying to create within the library. So by virtue of the fact that you're here live or watching this recording, you probably have had some experiences with libraries and or books that have been life-changing for you. Certainly, I have had those experiences. I was an English major way back in the day in undergraduate. However, I would also add to this that for vulnerable folks, libraries can be life-saving, especially when it's hot outside, as I know it is in Australia as well. And this is around the time that some library professionals think, well, that's not what libraries are for, and perhaps kind of make this face like Tina Fey, whether it's external or just internal in their own heads. And to that, I really say, you know, if books and movies and music and research and more books are available here, then why do we keep the buildings? I have no doubt that the politicians in my state of Texas would love to do away with physical libraries, sell the land, lay off the library staff, turn to their constituents and say, I am a fiscal conservative and I have saved so much tax dollars for you. But they don't do that. And so my question is why? And I think that it says something about how much we enjoy gathering together in public, and also how rare that is these days, right? Libraries, as I'm sure many of you are already well aware, are one of the only places available where people can just hang out and not be expected to buy anything anymore. And as such, libraries these days, in my opinion, are about people, not books. That's not to say that books will not always be an intrinsic, very important part of libraries. But I think increasingly our libraries resemble community centers almost more than they do kind of traditional libraries. And I see that as a good thing, because we're able to meet more of the community's needs. And as we're trying to meet the needs of the community, especially, again, we're thinking specifically about vulnerable populations, that work requires building trust with folks, both individually and collectively. It requires connecting with them on a personal level. And in my opinion, that requires us to also be vulnerable, but in a different way. Because a lot of the folks that we're working with in our public libraries are literally physically vulnerable. Their health is not good. Their mental health is challenging. They don't have access to clean drinking water. They may live outside. They are literally vulnerable. But in order to connect, oftentimes all of us need to be emotionally vulnerable. And so, as I say, courage really requires vulnerability. And in my opinion, vulnerability really requires courage also. This is important in the context of inviting helping professionals into a public library, because we're becoming interdisciplinary, right? The libraries are saying, hey, we're going to invite a new and different expertise into the building. And what I think that suggests is that libraries are essentially saying to social workers and helping professionals, we want to tweak what we do. We understand that we can serve the community better, and we want your expertise to influence the way that we do things. But however, that is not what we often see. This is true for myself and many of my library social work colleagues around the United States, is that folks are being hired without consideration of the social work code of ethics. In the United States, we have the National Association of Social Workers Code of Ethics, the NASW Code of Ethics. In Australia, there's the Australian Association of Social Workers Code of Ethics. In the US, there's also the American Library Association Code of Ethics. And I'm sure that there's an equivalent code in Australia too, but since I'm more familiar with the States, I'll use this example. The library code, the ALA code, says that libraries must remain politically neutral. The NASW code, the social work code, says that social workers must stand up against oppression and racism. In many communities, those two codes of ethics conflict. Some communities will see standing up against oppression as an inherently political thing. I disagree. However, library administrators need to be aware of that potential conflict. And what we see is that that doesn't always happen. Furthermore, I think that social work is really at its best when it's subversive, when it's challenging the status quo. It's flying under the radar of powerful folks to try to shake things up and make life better for vulnerable people. It's at its best when we are rocking the boat. Any social worker worth their salt coming into a public institution that is probably dozens, if not hundreds of years old, is going to notice the ways in which the institution is perpetuating trauma, is perhaps still engaging in white supremacy, as we saw already. Is a good social worker is going to come into an institution and assist staff, assist patrons, and also hold up a mirror to the institution and rock the boat in that way. So if any of you are considering bringing someone like me into your library, you must be prepared for the boat to rock. And in fact, I would say if you hire someone and they don't rock the boat, then you might not have made a very good hire, because a good social worker is going to come in and not only work with the individuals in your library, coaching staff, developing policy, they're also going to rock the boat. And as such, you can guess, but from the title of this presentation, we're also going to challenge the status quo and the way we've always done things, because as we all are more aware than we would probably like, status quo is not working so good. When I think about homelessness, I know that y'all are experiencing this in Australia, just like we are here in the States. We all agree homelessness is a problem. We have not fixed it, right? Nothing we have done has addressed the problem substantively. And in fact, at least here in Texas, homelessness is getting worse. We're all well aware, I think, of the increased cost of living in recent years. The houses I see out my own window right now are 40% more expensive than they were in 2013, right? People are losing their homes. We're not doing anything substantive about it. And I don't want to be too hyperbolic here, but I think often of this photo. You may recognize this. I think it was in 2021. There was I think it was a leaking oil drilling operation, and the ocean caught on fire. The Gulf of Mexico, not too far from the coast of Texas, caught on fire. And as you can see, I'm not an expert in putting out oil well fires, and maybe this makes sense in some sort of way, but what I see here is water on fire and human beings spraying water into the ocean. And when I think about status quo not working, I think that this is a powerful image of the futility of trying to send more of the same, right? We're putting water into water. The fire is continuing. I do not see it going out. And so we really have to rethink the way that we function, I think, as people, as library workers, and just life itself. Because like I said, things aren't going so well. It's a dark time right now. And I think that one thing that we can do to try and right the ship is think differently. So library patrons sometimes need a social worker. I think that there's a temptation to say that every library and every school and every hospital needs a social worker. And on the one hand, I think that would be great. Patrons don't always need a social worker, but I do think that all libraries can benefit from having us on staff or people like us. We bring a different training, a different perspective on public service. We bring that different codes of ethics. We bring different experiences to the table, and our voice is often unusual. Keep in mind, I used to work in schools where I was one of the only social workers. I used to work in the child welfare courts, mostly comprised of CPS, Child Protective Services, caseworkers, lawyers, attorneys, that sort of thing. Again, we're the unique voice. And I think that libraries, too, can benefit from having someone with a social worker's training and expertise, because we're serving people. And as social workers, that is what we are trained in. And so I would argue that any public-facing institution like libraries could benefit from having social workers on staff, or at least consulting with them and reaching out and saying, hey, we're thinking about developing X, Y, and Z. What do you think? Hey, we need to address drug use in the bathroom. What kind of policies would you recommend? That sort of thing. Even if your library cannot afford to bring somebody in, you can email me or other helping professionals in your area, and I bet you that you will receive some assistance. Like I've said, am more than happy to talk shop with you. So as I said, if you're bringing a social worker into your library, you need to be prepared for the boat to rock. And I think that this is a challenge for many folks in administration, because in many workplaces, especially municipal government or county government, depending on what umbrella your library falls under, in government, boat rockers are not usually promoted to ship captain. The folks who climb to the top of the ladder in government, in my experience, are usually folks who play by the rules and do it the way things have always been done, because that's what most of us are comfortable with. And so I think that looking at this from a social work perspective, when we get in there, we're not going to try and become ship captain or anything like that, but we do expect to be heard. And I think the one thing that has been happening, at least here in the States, is that oftentimes our administrations are not hearing us. And all of this relates back to that piece of courage, right? It's a dark time in the world, certainly. And I think that it's easy to forget about when the world's on fire, literally, and there are wars popping up all the time, and pandemics and rising costs of living. Unfortunately, I think that oftentimes the vulnerable among us are forgotten, even more so than they were in 2019. And I think that something that we can do, that libraries can do, is to shine a light in that dark space. It provides light for the folks that we serve, the vulnerable populations that we serve, so that they can see better. But it also provides light for us, too. I think that one thing I found is that trying to be courageous and vulnerable at the same time, and speak truth to power and truth to anyone who will listen, is that it also adds light to my own life. I feel lucky to be able to do this for a living. And I think that shining that light is hard work. It requires courage. It requires vulnerability, but it benefits the people we serve. And I think it really benefits us as public servants as well. So with that, I know we're a small group live here, but if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to take them. And Lisa has a question already. She says, do I have any advice about having the conversation with a director about the importance of people, not books? My director is very collection focused and does not see the value in free programs and events to our vulnerable community. Oof. I think, well, on the one hand, I think that if you have a director who's probably been playing by the rules, right, and has been following status quo for some time, that this is an uphill battle. And so the first thing I would say is this juice worth the squeeze for you in particular? If you don't know that, if that's an American saying, I don't know, is it worth it, basically? Is it worth the work to go to this person? Because it seems like this director has kind of shown you who they are already. So is this a battle that's worth fighting? I hope the answer is yes. In that case, I would start tracking some data if possible. Is there any way for you to track the number of times that a patron comes to the service desk with questions about housing, about legal aid, about domestic violence resources, and so forth? And if you can track that, I don't expect it to be perfect data, right? You're not going to ask every single patron those questions, but just the ones who just mention it, right? And then we know, oh my gosh, we're having 8 dozen conversations with folks per week about things other than books. This is a public service institution. We are not meeting those needs, right? Is this institution only about books? And if it really is for the director, then that's unfortunate. I find it hard to believe that somebody can sit in a library 40 hours a week with people, many of whom will be struggling, and think this is purely an information only institution. They may, and that is tough, but they may not. And I think that by trying to make an information or a data-based argument to someone whose profession is information should be compelling. I would hope it would be, at least.
That's a great point, Patrick, to bring in the data.
Yeah, well, I think I'm big on I talk about advocacy a lot, and a couple of my students are in here right now, and they know that already. But one thing when it comes to advocacy, I think and when people are pushing back on your position, you have to figure out what kind of argument are they making? Are they making a values-based argument, or are they making a data-based argument? And from this question, from Lisa's question, I'm not sure. Is the library director saying this is a library and it's only about books and we will only be about books? To me, that is a values argument. Or are they saying we don't have anybody coming in asking these questions? There is no homelessness in our community. That's something people used to say to me, and I knew that was incorrect. And you want to match what they are saying. If they are making a values-based argument, you want to counter with a values-based argument. If they are making a data-based argument, you want to counter with a data-based argument. Because if one person says, we have no people coming in with housing needs, that's a data-based argument. And if I say, well, it's the right thing to do to serve people with housing issues, we're not speaking the same language. But if I say we have a dozen conversations a week with patrons about housing situations, now we're speaking the same language. And the inverse is true as well. And so I think that's one really important aspect of advocacy work, especially when powerful folks are pushing back on us.
Yeah, because I actually had a question about your when you said you were tracking the patrons and 1 in 6 were coming from vulnerable populations. Mm-hmm. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, how you actually did that tracking. Were you, mm-hmm. Keeping little tallies on your desk? Or
yeah. And this is another opportunity for folks to email me, because I think I still have the tool that I created. It's an online tool, so I'm happy to share that if I still have access to it. but this was an area that was a learning curve for me. Again, I was one of the first library social workers, and I was the first in a community like mine that I was aware of. Uh, Folks in the larger metropolitan areas had partners and collaborations where they could collect data, but my city had never had a helping professional on staff ever, and had never tracked the needs of vulnerable folks ever. And so I immediately was like, well, I have to have some sort of idea of what's going on. And so I created basically a survey monkey tool, and I would track how often people mention to me. And again, I'm just listening to people, and they're just telling me. I'm usually not asking them directly, but I was tracking whether they were veterans, whether there were children in the home, because those are two populations where I felt like I could get traction in an advocacy sense. Because in Texas, military veterans and children are seen as more deserving of assistance than, say, uh, single men experiencing chronic homelessness. So I would track children and veterans. I was tracking victims of domestic violence. I was tracking the need, kind of like what was the predominant presenting problem that people were coming to me with, whether that was food or housing or transportation was a huge challenge, or that sort of thing. Because that helped me understand at least a little bit what kinds of issues people were bringing into the building, which we would never have known otherwise.
Great, thanks for that. And yeah, it's not like you were tracking the individual people, you're just kind of keeping a record of
Correct.
the issues. And
Yeah,
yeah.
I was not tracking
Yeah.
names or dates of birth or anything like that.
And Lisa has a great question as well. Why do you think Georgetown hired a social worker when they weren't ready to deal with one?
Thanks, Lisa. That's a great question. Gosh. I think that the library did notice a real and noticeable uptick in folks experiencing homelessness in the library. And they reached out to some of the nonprofits in the area who suggested hiring a social worker with a grant. So I was free for the first 3 years to the city. I think that had a lot to do with it. I also think that the library leadership at the time prided themselves on being seen as innovative. And this is a library that had and still has live music, and they check out bicycles, and there was a wedding there. And so this is a creative, innovative library, and I think that something appealed to leadership about being the first library in Texas to bring on a social worker, and that the excitement of that kind of spotlight overtook the pragmatic planning that actually needed to happen before bringing someone like me on. And so when I got into the position, and kind of the shiny newness of me wore off, and I was in offices going like, hey, we're re-traumatizing people. Hey, we're not developing policies to keep our staff and patrons safe from racist volunteers. That it was kind of like, whoa. And they had bitten off more than they could chew. And unfortunately, I think we've seen that in other library systems around the states. As I would say, again, this is just my ballpark guess. I would say that about 40% of the library systems that begin a social work position or collaboration stop it within a number of years, because I think that this is a politically precarious time in the United States, particularly in Texas, when it comes to books. The fact that I'm saying this blows my mind. Books and libraries and the role of public institutions. I want to be fair here. Library administrators have good reason to be afraid for people coming to remove books, for people coming to remove undocumented patrons, to stop libraries from doing what libraries do. However, I think that in the face of an existential threat, courage is required. And this is not a time to bury our heads in the sand. I think that this is a time to stand up for our values. And again, that's just something that I don't see often enough in administrations around the country. My position at the library that I've referenced in this presentation, when I left, it was not refilled. But I mean, I can tell you that there are people experiencing homelessness and domestic violence and all sorts of troubles in that library every single day. So yeah, it's unfortunate.
Great, thanks, Patrick. And we have another question from Patu. What planning needs to occur before getting a social worker in the library?
I would say that any library thinking about taking this leap should talk to at least 2 library systems that have already taken the leap, and at least 2 library social workers, because I want you to get a diversity of experiences and perspectives on how this has gone and what pitfalls exist and might be avoided. In addition to that, I would say, as I said already, to take a really close look at the code of ethics, both for social workers wherever you are and for librarians wherever you are, and try to look and see, like, where are there going to be conflicts? There probably will be. And that's not a bad thing, right? Librarians have a code of ethics. Social workers have a code of ethics. That's a good thing. But there will be conflicts. And so seriously considering how to navigate those conflicts, I think should be a part of the hiring process, right? You want to be able to ask these kinds of questions as you hire folks, because I think that oftentimes we try to train people up or figure stuff out on the back end. And we miss an opportunity, I think, during interviews and on the front end to really suss that stuff out first and foremost. Try and get to know people in the interview process. I think that values are something that, at least from my experience in municipal government, are often ignored in a hiring process. I think that a lot of government workers are frightened to talk about values during hiring processes. But what happens is that we hire folks and then we send them to a 1-hour diversity training or whatever, and we realize, oh my God, we've just hired a racist person, and we're going to try and train them into being not racist. I think that's a dangerous way of thinking, and I think that we have to put values at the front end so that we are not trying to train people up into caring about vulnerable people, but rather we are hiring people who care about vulnerable people already.
Thanks so much, Patrick.
Any
other questions? And I like Patu's comment that I think there are many courageous library managers in Australia ready to rock the boat.
Excellent.
But yeah,
are they hiring? I'm just kidding.
Definitely, I'm sure you'd be welcome over here, Patrick.
Well, if there are no more questions, I just say thank you again to CSU for having me, to all of you who are here live, and to all of you who are watching this and recording. Thank you. Please feel free to contact me. I'm happy to chat.
Thanks so much for coming, Patrick, and sharing your work. And yeah, it's so great to hear what you're doing.
Of course,
and
happy
the
to.
fact that you're an educator now, that you're spreading all the knowledge, and yeah, it's just really great.
Thank you.
So, and I've just popped into the chat the link for the recordings from all the series. We have one more lecture in 3 weeks with Leanne Mitchell, who's going to be talking about homelessness, and she's our Australian representative in this series. So that's really great. We're excited to hear from her too. So, great. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day or your evening, wherever you're coming from. Thanks.
Thank you. It was a great presentation, Patrick. Very engaging.
Thanks, Patrick.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. Yeah, it was. I've never done this where I've kind of picked up a presentation from a year ago and then given it again. So I'll have to compare the videos and